With us in Abu Dhabi today for the Processes of International Negotiation conference are Dr. Mikhail Troitskiy of the University of Madison Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia, who has 10 years of experience in political risk and NGO management consulting, and is a scholar on the subject of US-Russia relations, arms control, and international negotiations. And we also have Dr. Rudolf Schussler, who is professor of philosophy at the University of Beirut in Germany, and he's a member of the Processes of International Negotiation. His field of research comprises early modern intellectual history, modern applied ethics, and political philosophy. Dr. Troitskiy, you have spoken at the conference about the Russian perspectives on Chinese style of negotiations. Do countries always have a particular style of negotiation? And if you already know that, then how does that help in the process of negotiation?
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Haqqani, for having me here. And my takeaway from studying the subject matter of negotiation cultures and comparing them between China and Russia is that there's likely either no such thing as negotiation culture in contemporary world, or even if there are distinct negotiation cultures, there's not much of a difference in those cultures between China and Russia. And there are indeed some academic studies, well grounded, that show very little divergence between China and Russia on their manner of negotiation, on their preferred techniques, on how they see negotiations. There's a little variation with Russia, for example, adhering to a more informal approach to negotiation, and while being more direct in its messaging, while China is more formal, while being less direct. But other than that, I don't think cultures matter at all in negotiation, even between those such distinct groups as the Russians and the Chinese in contemporary world.
Is that just a phenomenon of the contemporary world, or would you say that the cultural impact on negotiations has been declining historically over time?
Yeah, I think there's a consensus among negotiation researchers that there has been a decline in the impact of distinct national cultures on negotiation, and for China, that, and as well as for Russia, of course, that kind of leveling of negotiation styles started as they emerged from, well, in the Russian case, communism, in the Chinese case, from the distinct type of Chinese communism and the beginning of economic reform. So since then, over the last 30 years or something, those countries and their representatives have been using more or less the same language, and more or less they have been understanding each other pretty well, even if sometimes it benefited one side or both to not just disclose the extent of understanding of the other side's position, but they were quite on the same page when it came to the issues at stake. And also there were not so many strategic issues at stake that would raise much controversy between China and Russia. So they have been able to negotiate smoothly on their borders and also on some economic cooperation. But whatever frictions arose in their negotiation were due to some rational positions and rational calculus on both sides. And I might address that if you want, but just stop this.
So basically it comes down to what each side wants in the negotiation, what its goals are, rather than negotiating behavior that determines their behavior, their negotiating strategy.
Yeah, you may well put it this way, but I would say it's sometimes about the interests, rational interests, not of the state as a whole, if we can speak about national interest as a concept at all. It's about bureaucratic interests. It's about leaders' preferences.
Political
it's about
interest.
policy goals, specific policy goals. So Russia's bureaucratic maze, as the Chinese tend to call it, has been there not because it's a typical, characteristic of some Russian culture, but it's just because of self-serving bureaucrats who simply don't want Chinese economic agents to acquire sufficient autonomy as players in the Russian market, in the Russian socio-economic system. And that, I think, has also been the preference of the powers to be of the Russian leadership. So whichever limitations occurred in China-Russia economic engagement over the past 2 or 3 decades were due to rational choices made by the Russian leaders and the Chinese leaders. So for the Russian leaders, it was important not to allow those economically powerful Chinese to become strong players in Russia. So bureaucratic maze was there to, help tame them down a little bit and only let them invest in the sectors where such investment was considered politically safe. That's just an example of not really culture, but bureaucratic or any other rationally calculated interests being at play in Sino-Russia negotiations.
Dr. Schussler, you approach negotiations with a background in philosophy and ethics. To what extent do philosophical and ethical considerations weigh in negotiations, especially international negotiations in this day and age?
Yeah, let me first thank you too for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and it is of course a matter of looking what kinds of negotiation and what actors use value-based negotiations so that a value-based ethical view becomes important. For example, the European Union is a typical actor which strives to promote democratic values not only inside towards its member states, but also in its foreign policy, and it struggles to formulate codes and ways that are acceptable to its external partners, and this is a challenge. It's not always the case that you see that these values play a role in successful negotiations. They're often also a cause for problems in the EU's approach to other countries. But in order to understand what the problem is, you have to analyze the mindset of the European negotiators and also the restrictions they face in the civil society, in the elite groups of the European Union, the European countries, towards the opposite would be a more politically realistic, more power-oriented negotiation style.
And you would say that the value-based negotiation approach creates more limitations than the power-based ones in terms of getting your goals, because if your goals are moral and ethical, or at least you think they are moral and ethical, they come up against other people's ethical and moral values as well sometimes. We are seeing that, for example, in Afghanistan these days. The Afghans turn around and say, oh, this is the Taliban say, this is our values. How can you dictate your values to us? And so that certainly affects and limits the negotiating process, in your opinion?
Indeed, it does. The first thing is that, of course, it depends on the international order you have. In an international order that's guided by rules and principles, and these rules and principles are aligned with the moral views of certain countries, it's easier to promote these moral views, that's clear. But in a situation where this order is in turmoil, when there is a transition to a new international order, it can become very problematic, and your Afghan example shows that indeed the typical problem you have for ages now with especially idealistic or moral negotiation styles is that the other side has moral views too, and this tends to exacerbate disagreement. It is akin to a religious war if two moral views conflict, whereas the conflict of interest is much easier to pacify, much easier to find compromises than if you have two different worldviews or two different moral convictions, because both sides, of course, think they're morally right, and they don't want to give up their moral claims, even if they would give up material claims, for example.
What would you say to those who say that sometimes the moral and ethical claims are actually just a way of covering up interests, and basically it is the raw pursuit of interests, just with a wrap around it of moral and ethical claims?
Yeah, that's a common accusation, and I think it's rarely true. There may be actors who really use moral views in a systematic, conscious way to deceive other people. But usually it's the way that they believe that their values are indeed true and they have a moral superiority over others. And the problem arises that people with that belief move to certain positions because they have support from their constituencies and then can influence the policies. So it's not that these people use their views, but there's a systemic aspect, so that the interests of some groups and countries help these people move to the foreground. So there is a connection to the interest, and all research shows, for example, climate negotiations, that the moral positions are correlated with the interests of the negotiators or the nations they negotiate for. So the correlation is there, but the causal effect is not one of purposive choice of a facade, but it is a deeper recruiting and opinion forming process that makes moral views that suit certain interests, they come easier to the foreground then. And that's probably what happens in the European Union as in many other places, because I really think, and the people I know in the European Union who believe in these kind of policies are true believers. They are not purposely trying to deceive others.
Well, thank you both very much for your views. Any final thoughts that you would like to share with our students and all those who watch this?
Yeah, well, I agree with Professor Schussler on the point that in contemporary world, we increasingly see positions dictated by rational calculus wrapped into the terms of morality or even more so justice and ethics. And in that way, they are presented to the negotiation counterpart and to the general public. And so we increasingly see that negotiations become a collision of two ethically grounded positions. So for the public and for the negotiator, the problem becomes to choose, either choose from one principle against the other, or to try and somehow combine those principles. But there's no avoidance of negotiating principles in contemporary politics, even if you see material interests clearly behind those interests.
Dr. Schussler?
Yeah, I would like to add something. Even if both sides may be true believers, in ethics you speak of threshold ethics. And the thresholds for switching between ethical principles and promoting one's interests may be different. For example, for the Taliban, they stick to their principles, their religious principles, to the end. They are very, very strong, and they have a very high threshold it's almost impossible to exceed that threshold so that they would give up their principles. For the negotiators of the European Union, that may be different. At a certain point, the interests may become so strong that they abandon their interests in moral principles. So this is an important difference to find out in negotiations where the thresholds of the sides lie in terms of moral commitment to the principles.
Well, the processes of international negotiations remain an interesting subject, a field in which there will always be multiple choices and multiple opinions. Thank you very much for joining us.